state is that it is set up to fail. So you make sure that the state cannot provide services, so you push for privatization, you cut social welfare, so that what's left of the state is just the coercive apparatuses of the state. And then, obviously, the state can't address the needs of its citizens. And this is again important because I want to tie this to the longer debate, the devolution debate in Sri Lanka, whereby if it is, and some of us are reinterpreting the national question as a question about state power, minorities' stake in state power. But then what is left of state power to address its citizens? So that's why I'm also emphasizing on this notion of the failed state and then the concepts of security and development. And given this sort of emphasis on security and development, which now the Sri Lankan government is also very much on board, right? So they would like to avoid any form of serious state reform. So the Rajapaksa government, if you look at what they've done over the last 3 years, from 5 years ago when both the major political parties were even in favor of some kind of a federal solution, now they've brought it down to purely a unitary concept of the state as the solution. And what their emphasis going to, following this war, is going to be on this idea of security for development. So the emphasis will be on some kind of post-conflict development. And with that framework in mind, they're mobilizing much support from various powers, including the donors. And here it's...
Excuse me,
yeah.
Would you mind, I'm really concerned to know who the donors are, the imperialist forces. Would you spell that out when you speak about it? It would be really good for us to know.
Sure. So if I have to give a concrete example, in 2003, there was the Tokyo Donor Conference, which, after the Norwegian peace process was initiated, in 2003 June, they had the Tokyo Donor Conference where $4.5 billion was pledged in development and reconstruction aid to Sri Lanka. And it had 20 multilateral organizations, so including the World Bank, the IMF, the Asian Development Bank. Those were the big multilateral donors in terms of Sri Lanka, as well as major bilateral donors such as Japan, the European Union. But Japan is the single largest bilateral donor. Now this donor landscape is also constantly changing. Over the last 2-3 years, the Sri Lankan government has mobilized other donors. So for example, China has become one of our bigger donors over the last 2-3 years. Sri Lanka cut a deal with Iran for $1.5 billion. They've just signed aid from Libya for $500 million. So the Sri Lankan state is also maneuvering against the West by mobilizing certain powers. But I would still say that the larger framing of the discourse around security and development, it has a slightly longer history, starting from the Washington Consensus, from the 1970s onwards. So we can get a bit more into the details during the question and answer session. I'm not sure if that addresses.
I just want to make sure that that's sort of spelled out for us, because that's a theme of the conference, to look at us versus imperialist forces and how we pull ourselves together. Thank you.
Right. And here I must also say that what I mentioned about this framing as security and development, or the war on terror, what I meant by it being entrenched within South Asia, I'm quite serious about it, in the sense that the war on terror discourse to Colombo doesn't just come from Washington or Brussels, right? So even if you read a lot of the think tanks in Delhi and what they write about Sri Lanka, they also frame it in those terms, right? So this idea of war on terror circulates within South Asia as well. So there needs to be a fair amount of critical thinking within South Asia about how we engage with the region from within. Just looking outside also is not going to help us get out of this mess. And and I think what many of us within the Tamil community, it's similar as well. Even when we look at Sri Lankan politics, how can we be self-critical while opposing the pressures from outside? Or within the Tamil community itself, what is the role of Tamil descent in terms of challenging the political questions from within the Tamil community while we challenge the Sri Lankan state? So I think this is a running theme in some of our thinking. And here I want to also touch a little bit, I know Rohini talked about the destructive character of the nationalisms in Sri Lanka. And just as, even though the Sri Lankan state is emphasizing security and development, and just as this framework of security and development is very much in South Asia and globally, what I find about nationalism also is that it's capable of spilling over into the regions, right? Or it gains support globally as well. And I think it's important to be alert about that. So for example, over the last year, you would have seen huge amount of mobilization in Tamil Nadu around what's going on in northern Sri Lanka. A spillover of nationalism, and for me it was very much characterized by a certain Tamil chauvinism coming out of Tamil Nadu, and we can get into that. Or for that matter, the role of the Tamil diaspora, which is now a fairly strong global actor spread out from Toronto to London to various other capitals. And what is that impact on events in Sri Lanka? And the important thing to note about this framing as security and development is that it's unable to respond to these nationalisms. Sometimes it further aggravates it, because you attempt to deal with the problem repressively in terms of security, rather than going at the political concerns themselves. So to give a concrete example now, if you listen to what a lot of the singular nationalists would be saying, that there is no national question in Sri Lanka. There is no major political problem in Sri Lanka. It's a problem of terrorism that needs to be wiped out, right? So that is on the singular nationalist side. On the Tamil side, in the Tamil nationalist extreme, the language is constantly of the genocide in Sri Lanka or the concentration camps in Sri Lanka. And both these discourses, in some way, one very much focused on the security side, the other in very nationalist, ethnicized terms, ethnicizes the problem. But what gets missed in the picture is the political question itself, which goes back to what I said earlier about addressing the question of the state, the need for state reform. Minorities share in state power. And it's in that context that I want to think about, what does solidarity from South Asia mean? Or solidarity from the South Asian diaspora left, or the left more generally in the West, right? At a minimum, I think it's very important to be conscious of the particular histories in each of our countries. And in the case of Sri Lanka, particularly, even how the national question or the debate around the right to self-determination or the devolution debate itself has changed over time, and there is constant engagement. How do we become part of it, rather, so that we don't either stand in just a dogmatic corner where we are completely disconnected from that debate, or that we don't become suckers for the international discourse in terms of how they are framing it, because that's what you're going to get from the mainstream media. So as a step, consciousness about the local debate, and then how we can act on it. Now I want to stop here because we'll have more discussion later, but I can give you, for example, concrete examples of how Indian engagement around security and development in Sri Lanka is impacting Sri Lanka, for example. So we can get into some of the question and answers.